Hello, my name is Keith Brightman. I'm Chief Financial Officer for the Wauwatosa School District, and thanks for watching the video. We appreciate the attention to our budget process. I joined the district back in June, and so getting experience here locally, but I have over 20 years of experience directly with school finance and helping districts optimize their budget strategies and think long-term. I'm optimistic. We have a team here that thinks long-term, thinks strategically, and I think you'll come to know and trust the work that we do over the next couple budget cycles. This video is an abbreviated version of what we plan, or what we will be talking about at our Finance Resources Committee meeting tonight on March 20th. So if you didn't get to make that meeting, this is a recap of that discussion and the key points. The focus of our video here is to review really a starting point for the budget planning for the next 2-year cycle. You can review the board approved budget for the current school year. I'll talk about where to find that. We'll then talk about a few budget scenarios looking forward over the next 2 years. I do a budget model that actually plans out 5 years, but given the just the strange environment of the last 2-year budget cycle and historic inflation and all the things that are playing into this next 2-year budget cycle, it makes more sense just to really focus on the next 2 years with an eye on the 5-year, but really focus on the 2 years. So with that, we'll start with the current year budget. It was a board approval item back in October 24th. So if you want to go back to that meeting on board docs and pull the actual board approval document, you can do that. Again, it's the October 24th, 2022 regular board meeting. The general fund budget does show a net deficit position for this school year. On paper it is, and it's reflected as it should be. In practice, however, we ended last year with a surplus of $1.7 million in federal revenues that were received as part of that surplus that were not anticipated last year and planned to be used for this current year budget cycle. So it's really a timing issue and a wash when you look at the 1 year to the next with that. And even if we didn't have those federal funds, the new team has come in. We've identified some operating efficiencies, some ways to increase revenues that I'll walk through as part of the scenarios also. So even without that, we'd have a balanced budget strategy in planning forward into future budget years. The second key point to the budget is ESSER funding, and that's the COVID relief funds the district received. Again, board docs is where you want to go to find the actual detail on that. The board did approve the plan for using those funds back in February 28th of 22. So again, board docs, go to that meeting. It's item 4A that you can look at to see the breakdown of what we're going to spend those dollars on and what the intent was. The explicit approval was these are short-term dollars used for short-term added positions. Sure, there are some things we'd like to be able to sustain as a district, but we'll need to incorporate those options like anything else in our budget cycle and planning as we move forward. So I'll show again how that factors into our scenarios and our long-term budget planning. So that's the first thing to talk about and really anchors us into the scenario planning that I'll talk about next. So planning forward is the next step. We're in a year of a new state biennial budget, so the 23-24, 24-25 school years will be directed financially from the next state biennial budget process. We're early in the process. We won't know the outcome in the school funding amounts until June at the earliest, July, August, hopefully at the latest. But our fiscal year and our new year for costs starts on July 1st. So the timing isn't great. Wisconsin's a little bit different than most states that the timing happens like that. Most states you get about a 6-month window to know what your funding is and then plan into that. Wisconsin just isn't that case. What we do know is the governor recommended a budget proposal for education and for across the state, but for education. So we've modeled that as one of our scenarios. We also know what the board approved back in January and then updated approval back earlier in March here. And so you'll see a lot of alignment between what the governor had and the Wauwatosa School Board legislative platform. And that's because we updated to really mirror that platform. And then we have one more item that I'll talk about with the scenarios that's embedded in there. But what happens, I guess the big question is, those are great, but what happens if the funding comes in at something less than that? So to address that concern, we've also modeled something at 50% of the Wauwatosa platform. So again, I'll show you that as part of the scenarios. The state legislature does have that constitutional authority to fund public education. And again, the last two-year biennium had $0 increases to revenue authority for schools. So we're optimistic that this next 2 years will have a little bit of a catch-up provision as well as some real-time funding, hopefully aligned more closely to CPI than they've done over the last 10, 11 years. And that maybe is a separate video. We'll talk about the school funding history and future in context of that. The state legislature works with what they call general purpose revenues at the state level. So that is sales tax revenues, property tax revenues that come to the state, other things that come to the state. And they're in a really solid financial position. I'll have one slide that we'll put on the screen that shows about a $7 billion surplus position. That's equivalent to our fund balance, and that's with a B, $1 billion amount. That's historic, and that's built up over time. Plus there's a $7 to $8 billion, and they're still working out kind of what those final or current numbers are. But that's their actual structural operating surplus right now. So why I throw those numbers out, it's important to know that the scenarios I'll show you from the governors and from the one that we've modeled locally, they're both fundable in a statewide context. Education's about 40% of the state budget. If they were to fund those surpluses at 40% level, they could fund everything that we're going to talk about here across the state. So I'm optimistic that it'll be something closer to the platform than not. But again, we're going to plan for a contingency with that. So with that context, I'm going to walk us through the actual scenarios. I'll start by acclimating you to the page. I believe we're going to put that on the screen. So we've developed this using a 2-year budget scorecard model. And we call it a budget scorecard because we put some easy indicators in there to show whether it's a balanced position or not, just simply with a green marker or a red marker. So it's easy to tell, are we planning into that scenario with something that's sustainable long-term with a balanced budget strategy or not. It doesn't mean we'll always land on a balanced budget strategy, but that's our position with planning forward with that. So we have a place in the 4 sections or 4 scenarios on the sheet in 4 columns format, and the items above the blue line are what really the state legislature is responsible from a funding standpoint, and they address the key budget inputs and assumptions that we have. So we have an enrollment line, we have the funding line, and then some key expenditure changes from one year to the next. Below that blue line is how we're going to plan locally. And that's where we can be more efficient, we can reduce costs, we can increase revenues, and we've looked at those options for next year and the next 2 years. And then we have expenditure impacts that we've either already done or will recommend doing for the next 2-year budget cycle. We refer to the things we plan on doing that are different than we do now as leverage items. And so we're taking resources internally and either leveraging those in a different way or taking new resources and investing in those options. And again, they're clearly laid out on the sheet based on the different scenarios. We'll also show the impact of keeping some or all or a portion of those ESSER funded COVID relief supports. And again, all that's on that page. So with that, I'll walk through the budget scorecard and each scenario. So that's where we take a little break probably and transition over to the screen. Okay. So on the screen, you do have the page with the 4 columns. As we look at that, you'll see, and I'll just acclimate you first, the first column is scenario 1, and they all operate the same after you get used to looking at one. So I'll just work with scenario 1, the first one. This is based on the Wauwatosa School District board-approved legislative platform again. The first key input is our enrollment and what do we expect to see happen with that. First, the enrollment here is not anything that matches kids in seats or anything that makes straightforward sense when you look at the number. This is the number that matters for revenue purposes. And so it's a count of resident students that attend Wauwatosa School District as well as resident students that open and roll out to other school districts. We add those together and that gives us our revenue authority number for each one of the years. We're showing basically a flat. There's a slight uptick in enrollments expected from a revenue standpoint for the next 2 years, but for conversation purposes, let's just say that we are expecting flat enrollment for those 2 years. On the revenue side then, the bold boxed in area, that's really the key drivers of our budget authority from one year to the next. As you can see in this year, the 22-23 column on the far left side of the page, there was no new funding that came into school districts to address that. There was a slight increase to special education aid, and that was really it for the current budget piece. You've probably heard that there was more money invested into education than ever before with this last biennial budget. That's true and it's not true. So it's true in that the state aid formula received a lot more money, but without a revenue increase to offset that or match with that. It's just a property tax reduction across the state. So again, there were no new spendable dollars for Wauwatosa or any school district across the state based on the last biennial budget. So for this next biennial budget round, we'd like to see a catch-up of the 2 years that had zero funding, as well as some type of indexed increase for the next 2 years. So in the Wauwatosa legislative platform, we have the $400 that would be aligned to play some catch-up for the last 2 years, as well as $350 that would be for year 1 of the biennium and $650 for year 2. Per pupil categorical aid is actually the Wauwatosa preferred way to fund public education, but we've shown it within revenue limits, and there's just a modest increase to those 2 line items of $24 and $45 in year 1 and year 2. Special education aid is doubling from about 30% reimbursements to 60% for each year of the biennium. We then have mental health aid, which is a new funding mechanism that was proposed by the governor in his budget recommendation of $100,000 per district plus $100 per student. That equates to $117 approximately for each student in our system. And then we have Medicaid reimbursements. You'll see Medicaid lower on the page too, a little bit different take than this line. Currently we have Medicaid services that are provided to students in our system, and we can then bill back a portion of those services to Medicaid directly and get reimbursement on those. Right now the state keeps 40% of that Medicaid reimbursements. The proposal is to give school districts back all 100% of that. So we've incorporated that into the financial model. So that's really the state legislative and state budget process responsibility of funding education is it within those areas. Unfortunately, the video we can't take questions directly, but we'll have some, I'm sure, at our finance committee meeting tonight. On the expenditure side, we then key in our key assumptions. Obviously, we're salary benefit driven system, people driven system, and so we've embedded a 4% increase as of July 1 of 23 as a salary increase and 3% in year 2. Those numbers are lower than we'd like. We do benchmark low on the compensation side, and so we'd like to play additional catch up, but we've done some of that this year, again, that I'll walk through lower on the page. In our health benefit structures, other benefits, about a 2% increase, and then pretty much everything else, we're just holding flat with no increase. And that is, I think, doable, but going to be difficult given we're facing historically high CPI in some of those areas, but we'll have to do our best to optimize how we work within that framework. You can then look kind of a net surplus deficit position based on just those inputs. And if you look at year 1, we go from a negative deficit budget this year, but again, a planned piece of 1.5 million up to about 2.8 million of a surplus for next year. So if we just stop there, we'd have the year of a surplus. And in year 2, it would be about a $1.5 million additional surplus, or 4.3 over the 2 years of the biennium. Of course, there are things we need to do with salary adjustments just to keep pace with the overall economy and work within our system. We want to add some pieces that will make our system operate more effectively and provide better supports to students, and so I'll walk through where we're at with those options for right now. It's important to note that these aren't even at the recommendation stage yet. These are scenarios only. And so we still have a lot of vetting to do internally with our leadership teams, with our board committees, with the Board of Education, with community feedback, staff feedback, all in the mix. These are just scenarios to show that we're starting that planning process and to show how we can react to various funding proposals given to us by the state. So very important to understand that. As you go just below that blue line now, you'll see the revenue and contingency adjustments. These are things that we've already identified, and some of them we've already put into place for this next year's budget cycle. The first one, we had some governor's discretionary funds, a portion of that upfront dollars that I talked about we received last year and used this year. We got another $640,000 this year that was unanticipated. So we can use those dollars then for next year. So you show it as an input for 1 year and then a back out for the second year, meaning we don't get it recurringly. We then have our Fund 27 transfer budget. That's a transfer we do to cover the local costs of special education within the system. We believe, based on historic context, we can reduce that by $250,000 and reappropriate those funds to another area of our budget planning. We then have another revenue item, the Medicaid revenue and reimbursements. This is different than the reimbursements that I pointed out above. We have changed providers and how we claim those costs. So we expect just by doing a change in and who we claim for and how much we claim, we'll see about a $600,000 increased revenue line item just from that. No additional cost structures, just how we're getting reimbursed for those costs. We then have our Fund 27 grant, aid, and local claims line. That is, again, just internally how we structure costs within our special education fund about whether they're aidable by the state or fundable by a federal grant or just funded locally, and how we structure those costs and optimize how we claim those reimbursements helps our bottom line. So it's much like the tax code. You want to use that to your benefit when you can. Again, we're going to use Fund 27 to our benefit as we can. So about $250,000 there. And then we have a supply budget contingency line in our current budget planning that has been unspent for the last 2 budget cycles of just over $500,000. So it's a contingency line that was built into the budget planning in the past that we just want to put more clearly out on the table for discussion about things we'd like to do with those dollars. So that is kind of that section. We then go to our expenditure impact section. We look at our support salaries market adjustments. That would be something that would be put in place for 7/1. We then have teacher salary adjustments that were done mid-year of the current school year of $185,000. We have teacher salary adjustments back in September of 22. That's when teachers could request a market analysis of their current placement within the system, and we funded about 110,000 of those adjustments. We did add some positions this year. You all recall the Dean of Students positions, some other student supports out at schools, and those about $1.1 million. So those are included in our forward planning. We have a teacher salary schedule that was put into place back on July 1, and we're seeing additional costs attributed to that of about $382,000, so making sure we account for those within our planning. We also have what we're labeling a staffing attrition and a vacancy allowance. Every year we have teachers and other staff retire from the system, are typically replaced much more often than not with lower cost individuals, and so we have a savings from that. And likewise, we have a vacancy pool of about $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 of unfilled positions within the system. And that's, again, historically just what we carry as a system, so we can account for those dollars in our planning. We did add a high school lacrosse program for next year, so that's $40,000 of additional expenditure. As we look at the page now in the pink shaded area, or kind of orange shaded area, that's where you'll see things now that we're labeling as our leverage items. And so I'll spend a few minutes on each one of those, and you'll see that those are the same for each one of the scenarios. This is where we'll throttle up or down based on our funding strategies we get from the state to make things balance out within this section. So an annual market adjustment, so much like I talked about with this year back in September, where teachers could ask for a market adjustment analysis, we believe that's a necessary part of our compensation structure, so about $100,000 per year added to the budget for that purpose. We'd like to optimize our elementary common planning time to allow for common planning better than we do now within the system. That's a $700,000 budget add for next year. We then have we'd like to centralize our copier system, copy machine replacements, and have a much more vetted and narrowed system of who we use for vendors. We'd like to make sure we're aligned to the state contract pricing, all those things. But there is a small local or district-wide budget add of $75,000 to address that. We then, in this scenario, have about $2.2 million of additional leverage items that could be considered. And we have a prioritized list that we're developing right now internally, and we'll share that out as we refine that over the next month or so, or 2 months. So that would be the 23-24 items. Looking at year 2, we have some additional leverage items. The ESSER funding expires at the end of the next fiscal year, or 2 years out. So we have a plan in place to fund about half of the ESSER positions and sustain those within what we have. So I mean, half would not be funded, half would be funded, and to be determined exactly what that means. Again, these are placeholder scenarios right now, so we have a lot of vetting to do there. And then the bottom line you'll see is a $500,000 change to how we levy and fund our facility maintenance projects. Currently, those are all levied to a Fund 41 where they're dedicated to facility maintenance purposes. If we don't levy there, it allows us to levy $500,000 into our general fund. So it's a wash from a tax perspective or income or property tax perspective, but yet it applies the funds then to our general operating budget instead of Fund 41. We do have a fund balance in Fund 41 that could be used for the drawdown and use of those facility projects, which was part of our planning anyways. And then our general fund does have a healthy fund balance that could be considered for long-term 30 to 50 year type facility projects, more in the one-time kind of category as we look forward. So all those things in the mix, if we did everything on this page for scenario 1 and had the funding we're showing in scenario 1, we'd end the year with a balanced budget position or a slight surplus of $124,000 over the biennium. So that's a lot to say for one scenario, but that's kind of how it all fits together. I'm going to jump over to scenario 3. That's the governor's budget scenario. That's the one second from the right on the page. Everything is the same in that scenario to what I showed in scenario 1, except for a $400 per pupil kind of make-up provision for the last 2 years of having $0 funding. I think this is possible within the current state budget. In fact, Joint Finance did put in that amount into the last state budget to address what they labeled as a fiscal cliff. And so we're hopeful that they consider that and include that in their next round of planning. Also, in addition to planning into a CPI type based adjustment for the next 2 years. So that's the only difference between the two columns. Based on that loss of the $400 per student, you can then look down on the page and we've backed out the $2.2 billion in really unidentified leverage item priorities for the next biennium. And we dropped down a little bit in year 2 about what's funded too. But by doing that, we'd also be at a balanced budget piece for the next 2 years with a $10,000 surplus shown over the biennium. So either way, it's a balanced budget strategy. It's just living within the resources that we have and are provided at the state level. And then scenario 2 is really 50% of that, right? So what happens if we don't get funded at the level the governor had or the level the school board has requested, and it's something like 50% of that? What do we do to address and react to that? Right now it's showing a bottom line of a deficit position and a title not recommended. So we would not bring a recommended deficit position to the board planning forward on an operating purpose, but I wanted to keep that on there just to show the magnitude of the impact of not being funded at the rates that we're requesting and what it takes to make our balanced budget strategies work if that were to be the case. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. We could develop 100 scenarios and none of them are going to be right. We won't know until we get much further down over the next couple months with the balanced budget or the budget strategies at the state level. Scenario 4 is a placeholder waiting for what we get out of our Joint Finance Committee of the legislature. And then we can populate and model exactly what that means, show what it takes to get to a balanced budget within that framework, just like the others, and then aid our planning going forward from there. Likely what's going to happen with that is Joint Finance will come out with something lower than what the governor had, and there'll be some type of a reconciliation between the two, and so we'll land somewhere within that range. Again, to be determined, and we'll do everything we can do to, again, plan strategically, address strategic plan items, but then also fund and live within the resources that we're allowed. If you go further down on the page, you want to do some quick math in your head, and what if we did a 5% increase versus a 4% on staffing salary increases? Each 1% of a salary increase in the gray shaded box is about $480,000. So you can round it to 500. Just say that's kind of the magnitude of doing it. 3%, 1% less, or 5%, 1% more, what would that be? Likewise, if we were to align our salary increases to CPI, which is just above 8%, we then should be at an 8% level, which would be at about a $1.9 million increase to the budget strategy. So just so you can kind of play with that in your own head if you like. Likewise, if we were to receive $100 in additional per pupil funding, what would that mean? It's about $588,000 of additional resources then that can be used within the system. Likewise, if we receive about $100 less, same number, $588,000 less in resources. Our total ESSER staffing impact is about $1.8 million. If we have $850,000 shown in scenario 1 to sustain some of those in year 2, that's about half again of what we have in the system. The fund balance and the use of those for facility projects is explained briefly. And then we feel a need to look at student transportation within the district. That's currently not provided. It would be a new cost structure for the system. And we don't want to forget about that, but it's currently not addressed from a funding standpoint within our scenarios. It's likely a $2 to $4 billion line item if we were to add that. And so we want to be careful that we plan into that prudently and make sure that that's something that prioritizes against other things within the system before we would go with that. So that is the budget scorecard kind of at a glance. It's a lot of information to take in one setting, but we'll roll this out over the next several months and update these as we move forward. So I think it will make sense as you see it a few times and you see us react to different funding headlines and strategies that come out of Madison and the legislative process. So thank you. Thanks for your time and appreciate it. Thanks.